our podcast, Who Are You Really? And today we'll be talking about race based trauma, PTG, and racial identity narratives. And I'm your host, Pachia. I'm a health science major and I'm also a Hmong American.
Hi, my name is Charlize. I'm a sociology major and I am Guinean African.
And my name is Denmark. I'm a health science major and I'm a Filipino American.
I'm Jasmine. I am a criminal justice major and I am Mexican American.
And so the purpose of our podcast today is to show how writing and storytelling can help people heal and grow after racial trauma by turning negative narratives into empowering ones.
Let's talk about post-traumatic growth. According to Chin, post-traumatic growth is a profound change within an individual in which a traumatic experience prompts deep questioning, deconstruction, and reconstruction of one basic schemas about oneself and about life, ultimately resulting in personal growth.
So, moving on to race-based trauma. Race-based trauma is the emotional and psychological harm someone goes through because of racism and discrimination. It can happen from personal experiences like being treated unfairly because of your race, or even from just witnessing racism in your community or on the news. This kind of trauma can be really painful as long-lasting, especially when it keeps happening over time. According to Chin and colleagues, racial trauma usually isn't a one-time event, and it's often ongoing and builds up over time, which can really impact people's mental and physical health. It's been linked to PTSD, depression, anxiety, and even physical symptoms. And according to Chin, it's sadly a common part of life for many racial minorities, with some really damaging effects if it's not like addressed properly.
This involves effective cognitive processing model of PTG, which is a repeated appraisals of the traumatic event, with each appraisal embodying challenges to one's previously existing schema. This also involves an intrusive rumination, which is when the individual is forced to reflect on their trauma when they don't want to, and deliberative rumination, which is when an individual intentionally reflects on their trauma experiences.
And so another component to this model is racial identity. And according to Chen, racial identity is defined as an aspect of one's self-concept derived from a sense of belonging and commitment to a particular racial or ethnic group. And it includes self-identification, pride, and positive valuation of the group, and taking part in the group's tradition, practices, and values. And so people with strong racial identity tend to have higher self-esteem and are typically less stressed and show fewer depressive symptoms. However, they have an increased awareness to discrimination. Therefore, they may perceive like ambiguous situations as racist, and especially when they feel discriminated against, they experience higher levels of psychological stress. And also, according to Chen, a study was done that showed that high racial identification intensified the negative mental effects of racial discrimination for American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Latinx individuals, while moderate racial identity served more as a buffer for Asian Americans and Black Americans.
Another key point would be identity narratives, which basically are personal narratives or stories constructed by individuals about their lives that gives meaning and defines who they are. The focus of racial identity narratives also aligns with the historical trauma framework, according to Ortega, which deals with the mass level intergenerational trauma, such as genocide, and which has been criticized for overlooking the effects of present-day racial trauma. According to Kiermaier, as questions about one's racial identity will likely raise the collective history of the group. Davis says to create and strengthen identity of oral storytelling and autobiographical writing have been used as part of clinical interventions.
And so now, since we kind of introduced what racial-based trauma is and the model surrounding it, I want us to share more about our narrative identities, our personal stories. So starting off with Charlize.
Well, I am the youngest of For all girls, I was born in Portugal, but I'm ethnically African. I was raised by a single mother, and coming to the United States at the age of 15, I barely spoke any English, and I kind of had a very harsh cultural shock. I kind of already knew that racism was everywhere. However, it was like my first time, like where I experienced it with people that kind of looked exactly like me. I have experienced like race-based trauma that changed like how I talk, dress, and act, and all like to avoid to be part of the stereotype. However, like on the bright side, like having it, I mean, if there is a bright side, having experience that only made me grow and look at life from a different perspective and to be like, my true self and be more comfortable in my skin. Yeah.
Does anybody want to like add on to that or have questions for Charlie's?
I could add to that. So, as a Filipino American, I've experienced race-based trauma that made me question my identity. I believe my family history, including past discrimination faced by my grandparents, affected me like growing up. With support of my siblings and parents, I began to embrace my culture, and instead of hiding it and accepting my identity, helped me grow stronger and more confident.
Actually, I do have a question for you. Okay. So when you're talking about like discrimination faced by your grandparents, like I mean if you're comfortable sharing it, you don't have to, but
Yeah.
like you like kind of like explain that more.
So, when my grandparents were new to here in America, they originally moved to Hawaii first before moving here to California. So they told me like in Hawaii, like some of the locals, like especially the white ones over there, they were basically like making fun of their skin color and like just like telling them to like go back to their country. It's kind of like similar as we're like experiencing right now. We're like especially like, those Republicans, those Trump supporters, they were basically like telling people to like go back to their country.
I would have to say that I could actually relate to that also as well. I would say that like as a first generation being Mexican American, I have also faced racial-based trauma from an early age, from language barriers, family expectations as well, and educational barriers. I am the oldest out of 3 siblings, making me the fourth, and this has made me deal with stress and imposter syndrome from a very early age as well.
Well, okay. Well, all you guys have interesting stories. Honestly, I can relate to like all you guys' stories, like especially with Charlie's talking about how she didn't want to fall into like stereotypes, and then Jasmine with the language barrier. So personally for me, like my story, so before my dad remarried, I was the youngest child out of 7 siblings, and my first language was Hmong. But when I started going to school, like I spoke mainly English, and then also at home, we used to speak a lot of Hmong at home too, but then we started speaking mainly English too, because I think it's because like a lot of people, we have like a lot of different ethnicities in my house, so it's not like a full Hmong house, so that's why English became the primary language. But that really like affected me a lot, because like me not practicing my language at home, it really like made me feel disconnected like to my own like heritage and stuff. So like talking about like being discriminated against by my own family, I would have like, aunts and uncles or like elders, even friends that were Hmong, that would tell me like, oh, like you're not like Hmong enough, but they wouldn't say it in a way where it's like directly to my face. It's more of like little things like, how come like you can't do this and that because you're like a Hmong daughter, right? Stuff like that.
Basically just microaggressions because it's either
Yeah.
you're too American for them or like,
Yeah.
and then for the Americans, which is like the corny thing to say, but it's basically like that.
Yeah, but like it's true though, right? So, so then like, throughout my whole life, like I felt like really inadequate, like as a person, and I felt like really unworthy of like who I was. So yeah, that's basically like the gist of it. And also I guess like to add on, like I tried to like with the stereotyping thing, like I tried to fall into like the stereotype of like the perfect like Hmong daughter. but like it just did not work out for me. And I was like in a relationship with like this like perfect Hmong guy like for 4 years, and like I said, like it was just a lot of pressure, so I couldn't do it. And after like, you know, we weren't together anymore, that's when I started to realize that it was my racial identity that I couldn't cope with. So I have another question. So, you know, talking about our narrative, our personal stories, how have you guys achieved growth in the aftermath of like all your trauma and stuff like that?
Honestly, like for me growing up, it was more of like, well, like having my mom like always telling me like, you have to act a certain way so you don't get treated a certain way. Like I just kind of learned how to disassociate from like, like the people that were like very like proud and loud about their racism. So you kind of just have to pick and choose your battles, like, so like I was a kid that like took a lot of things like very personally, and like like I would always get upset like of off everything. And then just growing up and seeing that I'm going to experience that at school, my like any job, like like you just need to learn how to navigate through that. So there's things that you should pay attention to, and there's things that you just should like put it to the side, which I would say like most microaggressions, little comments here and there. And you just kind of learn how to navigate through that. Like, and it helped me also like, besides being a racial thing, it helped me like, like also deal like with friends, like, when you're expressing your feelings of what to express and what not to express. So disassociating is not as bad as people think, because you just learn how to give priority to things that actually matter and actually are going to help you like grow. So that was like what worked out for me best.
For me, I really like grew up by learning how to like accept my profound identity, and I started embracing like who I am, which like really helped me to like heal. And I believe that my self-efficiency and resilience grew as I kept like reflecting and setting like small goals and learning on my like community and my family.
I would say that after like facing race-based trauma as a first generation Mexican American, I had the support of like my family, which also came like a very long way. I found comfort in like knowing more about my culture and all that came with it as I got older. I learned how much more in common like I also had with others as I opened up and spoke to others. I think when we're younger too, it's kind of hard to open up or relate to somebody just because of cultural differences or because we look different. But then when you speak up on it, you realize how much more in common you actually do have. And this just goes to show me that I've experienced my own growth by being able to also connect with others. And I believe that active like coping strategies such as like discussing the experiences with others or like taking action would go to show us how much just associated we can be, and there's just like a much more better outcome. And this has allowed me to reconstruct like my identity, and it has helped me develop psychological strengths like resilience as well.
Yeah, that's great. So for me too, like just kind of to like reiterate a little bit, like I experienced a lot of like covert racism, which according to Hemmings in that article, like covert racism is like Charlie said, is microaggressions that reflect the attitudes and beliefs about individuals of certain races, right? And so I think like learning to be more forgiving of myself too in general, it's like kind of taught me like how to deal with what I experienced, I guess. And like learning that the trauma that I faced, like what people said to me back then, especially like about like my race and stuff, like that wasn't even my fault. Like, you know, like those people said it, but that had nothing to do with like how like inadequate I am as a person or how like worthy I am. So like also like another big part of this that kind of made me like come to that understanding was like we talked about like sharing your narrative stories. So like I had some people in my life that I did trust enough to talk to about like what I was going through, and like that helped me understand like myself better, and like yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well, you have a support system.
Yeah. Okay. Um, I guess okay, so also, I mean, do you guys have any other like questions to add on to our narrative stories or anything else to add on or talk about?
I was just going to add, like, like, especially because our group, like, we're all like different ethnicities. Like, it really just comes to show that there's statistics and studies that show like one race suffers more than the other and whatnot. But like, it really is just kind of like an overall, like, everybody goes through it. Like, one more than others, but it's still as hurtful to
Yeah.
anybody. And the problem is always with the oppressor, not with the oppressed. So that's what I wanted to add.
Yeah.
For me, I have one question to ask you guys.
Mm.
So, how would you guys describe PTG when it comes to like experiences with racism?
Well, I would say like for me it's kind of weird because like I didn't ever experience, or not that I know of, but I never really experienced racism like outside of like
Mhm.
my ethnicity because like I said, like I was heavily like discriminated against by like other Hmong people. I don't know if like it's like a, if I would call it like racism though, but definitely discrimination. But I would say like discrimination is a part of like PTG too, like
Yeah.
because like we just to understand yourself more by sharing your story, and then like creating, being able to take control of your narrative instead of having other people. I think that's like the best way you can reach PTG, right? But I don't know. What do you guys think?
I also agree, like, it's the better, like you said, like, it really is the personal how you choose to, like, overcome the issue. If
Yeah.
you want to go like in a bad way or like you have a bad response or have a positive response, that's what my mom taught me, like, how to do. Like, she kind of prepared me for it. It was like, you just got to learn how to deal with it. And sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't. And you just try to kind of find comfort within your own people, like your family or your community, or like, like, I don't know, at schools as well, like, they have like little groups and stuff. So you always try to find like, some type of support.
Yeah, like even though it's painful, like some people grow by like learning more about themselves and like becoming more resilient or like finding ways to like, help others.
Yeah. I know, I feel like a lot of like, we're all coming like together more and more. Like, there's still a very much like ethnic or like race different, but I feel like we're all coming like together. Like we're, especially with the help of social media, I feel like it's definitely helping us see like all the issues. Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so since nobody has any more questions, we can wrap up our podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so to conclude, I want to kind of like reiterate like how all of this relates back to our model, right? So we talked about race-based trauma and racial identity narratives. Race-based trauma is basically a common occurrence that can be painful and long-lasting. And to better understand race-based trauma, we must understand what racial identity is too. Racial identity is the aspect of one's self-concept derived from a sense of belonging and commitment to a particular racial or ethnic group. And so we all agree, right, that the best way to reach PTG when faced with race-based trauma is to tell your narrative story, whether that's through writing, storytelling, or like this, a conversation. So I have one last question for everybody. So why might it guide others towards survival and growth in the aftermath of trauma?
I believe like race-based trauma is helpful in recognizing that the trauma is real. Like, a lot of people are just kind of like, oh, like, it's gonna happen, but like it's real, like, it can change you and it impacts like one's health, so therefore it should be validated. It also teaches like, us to be educated and like also raise awareness about like the ongoing reality of racism, especially with microaggressions. Like, it's still some type of like discrimination, And it is important to use those events to your knowledge and find a bigger purpose as well.
I think that by reflecting and changing how we view racial identity, like people can find pride, purpose, and strength. And this process really like helps people feel more in like control of their story and gives them a chance to grow emotionally and mentally, like even though they're facing like discrimination and trauma.
I think that also by acknowledging that experiences of racism can lead to long-term emotional and psychological distress, it helps us better understand the layers of trauma and what we're facing. Healing from race-based trauma is a long-term process that involves both individual and collective efforts.
Yeah, and I would say like being able to reflect on yourself and sharing your narrative identity is like a great way for you to understand yourself and learn to be more forgiving and loving of yourself as a person. And then also like when you take control of your narrative and not let it be clouded by judgment from other people, you can start to build like a new identity for yourself, one that fits your morals and values or whatever you want to be. All right, so that's our podcast. Our podcast is Who Are You Really?